Welcome back, everybody, to Thursday's Theology. My name is Jeff, and I'm your host. And we are currently in the series Summer with the Saints, and we've covered the life of St. Augustine of Hippo and St. Mary of Egypt. And this week we have Jake back, and he's going to tell us about his own patron saint. But before he begins, I'm going to ask him, Jake, what is a patron saint? How does a saint become your patron? Yeah, how does that work?
So, in general, all the saints pretty much have a patronage of some aspect of life, whether that be like St. Christopher with the patron saint of travelers, or St. Lucy being the patron of eye problems, and it usually has something to do with something they personally experienced in life. So St. Christopher carried the child Jesus on his back across a river, and that was actually his job, was to like carry people across a river because he was a big, strong man. St. Lucy had her eyes plucked out and then miraculously restored, so that is what led to her patronage. Personal patron saints, though, are kind of when you have a particular affinity, attraction to a particular saint. In a way, someone who really exemplifies what part of the body you are called to be yourself. So they're a model to emulate and someone to guide you in your path to follow Christ. Someone who did it successfully, so now you can emulate them as they emulate Christ.
Nice. Okay, so that being said, this week we're going to cover your own patron saint, and who is that?
That is Therese of Lisieux.
Therese of Lisieux. Okay,
Yeah.
So tell us about her.
So she's known by a lot of names. She's one of the most popular saints in the history of the church, which is quite incredible because she died at 24. She was a cloistered nun, known in her lifetime to a very few amount of people, but within just a couple of years of her death, she was known around the world. And again, she is one of the most popular saints in the history of the church. She's a doctor. Basically, any honor you could imagine has been given to this young woman. So she was a French Discalced Carmelite nun, as I said, cloistered, and she, in her own lifetime, appeared very unremarkable. Like even when she was dying, her sisters, when they were talking about writing her obituary, were saying, "Well, what can we write about her? She hasn't really done anything."
Interesting.
But she produced massive volumes of work. She wrote plays, poems, prayers. But what she's most famous for is her spiritual autobiography, which is called Story of a Soul. And kind of came about by accident. It's composed of her childhood memories, which she wrote down for her sister, who's actually her prioress. Another is a letter she wrote to another sister. And then the last part is the continuation of her memories written to her prioress at the time as well. And what it is, really what she set about to do was see what God had done in her own life. And she was able, by this reflection, to see what Jesus had done for her, how he had personally guided her throughout her entire life and protected her from a lot of things. The thing about her is, like, even though she's extremely popular, I feel she's very often misunderstood and not well known because a lot of people say she's completely unrelatable. It is true, she never committed a mortal sin, which, people hear that, they're like, okay, how can I relate to this girl who grew up in a sheltered home? She was in a cloistered convent, never really exposed to the world. But very often when people read her autobiography, they say, I relate to her so much now. Because they see how human she was. And by her own words, she said, I am the weakest, littlest, and most imperfect of souls. So what she's really famous for, though, is called her little way, which, so I just want to read out of Story of a Soul real quick. This is in manuscript C of Story of a Soul. She writes, Mother, I have always wanted to be a saint. Alas, I have always noticed that when I compared myself to the saints, there is between them and me the same difference that exists between a mountain whose summit is lost in the clouds and the obscure grain of sand trampled underfoot by passers-by. Instead of becoming discouraged, I said to myself, God cannot inspire unreasonable desires. I can then, in spite of my littleness, aspire to holiness. It is impossible for me to grow up, so I must bear with myself, such as I am with all my imperfections. We are living now in an age of inventions, and we no longer have to take the trouble of climbing stairs, for in homes of the rich an elevator has replaced these very successfully. I wanted to find an elevator which would raise me to Jesus, for I am too small to climb the rough stairway of perfection. I searched then in the scriptures for some sign of this elevator, the object of my desires, and I read these words coming from the mouth of eternal wisdom, and this is from Proverbs, Whoever is a little one, let him come to me. And so I succeeded. I felt I'd found what I was looking for. But wanting to know, oh my God, what you would do to the very little one who answered your call, I continued my search, and this is what I discovered. As one whom a mother caresses, so I will comfort you. You shall be carried at the breast, and upon the knees they shall caress you. And that's from Isaiah. So, and basically kind of a little summary of what the little way is she writes, in manuscript B, which is a letter to her sister, Jesus does not demand great actions from us, but simply surrender and gratitude. And so the little way is very often summarized by doing little things with great love, which is true, but I feel at the same time it also loses a little bit if you kind of condense it down to that, because it really is complete and total abandonment to God. And later on, her sister, who really helped promulgate her devotion to her and her little way, called it the little way of spiritual childhood, which is really what it is. And as Therese herself said, it's the way of the child who sleeps without fear in its father's arms. And even Pope St. Pius X said she rediscovered the heart of the gospel, because over and over Jesus says, you must receive the kingdom as if you were a little child, which is what her whole thing was about.
Right.
She constantly referred to herself as a little child, but seeing how this is actually who God draws to her. And this was revolutionary at the time. This is the late 19th century in France, when they're still dealing with the consequences of the Jansenist heresy, which portrayed God as this very angry, vengeful God who was more eager to pour out judgment rather than mercy. She even had her own effects of that. Her grandmother had been a Jansenist, and she inherited those tendencies from her mother. She endured scrupulosity, and she naturally had a tendency towards a melancholic temperament. But she saw through the reading of the scriptures, through being diligently taught by her family, that God is a loving God, and that he's eager to pour out his mercy, not his judgment. Because he says, God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but rather to save it. Right. So her model is just reckless abandon, basically.
Okay. And I want to go back and touch on something you said about just the little way, because I think it's important to also highlight that we've been talking about these saints and looking at these saints and looking at their lives and like, oh, that's totally like unattainable. I can't do that. Because I think we have this misnomer of understanding like, oh, in order to serve God, we have to, do this grand gesture. Right. We have to, sacrifice everything. We have to, But I think what I'm hearing from this understanding of the little way is that it's in the little everyday decisions to surrender to God that is where mercy and love is found.
Exactly. And that to her is where sanctity was found. She herself says, great actions are forbidden me. And the analogy she uses is, okay, well, love is proved by works. So the work she will do is scattering petals around the throne of God. And then he will take these, and since he's touched them, since he's delighted in them, he'll pour them out upon the church to give them what they need. Yeah. So, and the way she kind of described it is loving in the place of her brothers who are out doing the fighting. So, but it's revolutionary because it calls everyone to holiness, which is what everyone is called to. Yeah. Just doing everything out of love for God, not having to go be a hermit in the desert. Yeah, some people are called to that, but not everybody is.
Like Saint Mary of Egypt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
See, I remember. So, for those who aren't necessarily very familiar with like a cloistered lifestyle, so you mentioned that Therese is a cloistered Carmelite nun. Yeah. So what does cloistered mean? What does Carmelite mean?
So a cloistered nuns, there are some cloistered male orders, but it's very often the women who are. The cloister is, there are certain female orders, they will go into the convent and they will never leave it again. Okay. They will live within the confines of the convent for the rest of their lives, and they'll be praying, doing work, doing whatever. But they really are the backbone of the evangelistic church, because the church is a mission, and however, if it's not supported by prayer, it's going to fail. So these sisters take it upon themselves. Very often, they're praying specifically for priests. Therese herself had 2 priests entrusted to her who she diligently prayed for. And they're offering prayers and sacrifices for the success, for the conversion of sinners, for the success of missions, etc., etc. The Carmelites are one of these orders. So she specifically was a Discalced Carmelite, and the Discalced Carmelites are a reform order founded by the famous Therese of Avila and John of the Cross in the 16th century. And so the Carmelites were originally founded as a hermit order on Mount Carmel in the Holy Land. Okay. They were forced to leave after the Muslims reconquered that area, and they had to change their lifestyle in the Middle Ages. The men became friars, similar to the Franciscans and the Dominicans, so no longer hermits, but rather living in community, but going out and preaching to the common folk. Mm-hmm. The women, though, were always cloistered, but by the time of the 16th century, when Therese of Avila came, she realized that there was a need to go back to their hermit roots. And that's really what she was aspiring to in the Reform of Carmel. So the Carmelites, each order has a specific charism, and their charism is contemplation in action, always contemplating what is God doing in my life. Mm-hmm. And so their patroness is Our Lady of Mount Carmel, mm-hmm. so the Virgin Mary, and really imitating her constant heart pondering prayer. Because it says over and over in Luke's gospel, and Mary kept all these things, pondering them in her heart. Yeah. So in emulation of that is in essence what contemplation is, seeing what is God doing. And that's essentially what the little way is what is the demand of love from one moment to the next.
Right. And it's interesting too, because I think that the stereotype of kind of cloistered living is that, you know, like, if you keep acting bad, I'm going to send you to a nunnery. You know? Yeah. But it sounds to me more like it's a lifestyle that you're called to, as opposed to something you happen to like. I don't think anybody's just like, you know what would be a great job? I'm going to be a nun. Yeah. You know?
It's a very specific calling, especially to Carmel, because Therese, she entered at the age of 15, which is extremely young. And she went all the way up to the Pope to ask permission. But people kept saying, you're too young, you're too young, you're too young. And especially because Carmel is it's a hard order. It's not one of... So, but she was determined. She was saying, no, God is calling me to enter right now. So, and she was... The famous story is actually she had been refused permission by the superior, by the bishop. So she said, all right, I'll take my case to Rome. And they had a private audience with Pope Leo XIII. And the priest who had gone with them said no one's allowed to speak, but she defied that and said, Holy Father, please let me enter. And he said, you will enter if God wills. And she was literally picked up and carried out by the papal guards. She refused to get up.
That's awesome.
This little 14-year-old girl, just please.
That's awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Jake, for sharing about Therese of Lisieux. Mm-hmm. That concludes this week's episode of Thursday's Theology. Next week, who are we going to be studying?
Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati.
Oh, nice. Okay, that's a mouthful of a name.
A little bit.
So join us next week for that. And thanks for joining us this week. And remember, theology doesn't always have to be difficult. It is simply the study of who God is. Take care. We'll see you next week.